two more forums this semester, still occurring roughly every 2 weeks. But today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Jacob Wegmann. Didn't we have you scheduled the week before? Something changed. Oh, it was the graduate open house. Jacob's been an assistant professor in CRP here. How many of you are in the CRP program? How many of you are architects? All right, architects. Love to cross bridges, cross discipline. And Jake says he's going to say some provocative things about design.
Design implication.
All right. So he's been teaching at CRP since 2014. He teaches a quantitative methods course and 2 courses in real estate development. His statement of research is interesting. It says, focused on housing affordability with particular emphasis on housing production in supply-constrained metropolitan regions. I tried to look up supply-constrained metropolitan regions, and what I got was Austin. He got his PhD in CRP from Berkeley. So, Jake, welcome to our series. Look forward to hearing you.
So, thank you, Professor Benedict, for the invitation, and I hope that, like he said, I hope there are enough design implications in what I'm talking about to hold the attention of the designers among you. Although I will say that as predominantly young people, I would imagine that a lot of the issues I'm going to talk about here are probably things that you experience in your own lives. So I think housing affordability is an important topic that touches just about everyone. So what I'm going to do today, in keeping with the spirit of the CAD Lunch Forum as an opportunity to talk about ideas that aren't fully cooked yet, what I'm going to show you, this represents what I see focusing most of my research on over the next 5 to 10 years of my academic career. So these are things that I'm thinking about a lot. And today I'm going to give you the less restrained, less polite version of something that I said to the Austin Planning Commission. So, and I'm going to structure this as what I'm going to call 7 hard truths that will kind of collectively make an argument. And I'll give you a couple of silver linings too, just to not make everything too heavy in here. So let's just dive right into it. So hard truth number 1: long-term national scale structural forces are going to keep making Austin for more and more unaffordable for the foreseeable future. So we talk a lot about gentrification and gentrification hitting certain neighborhoods and not hitting other neighborhoods. I think it's really important just to be clear about what's the big picture force that's underneath all of this. And this graph will come as no surprise to any of you, but incomes are flat in Austin, and rents and home prices are skyrocketing. Okay, so you all know that. But that's the big picture that's going on, and the underlying structural force that really lies underneath all of this. My favorite term for it is inversion, or in the words of this journalist Alan Ehrenwald, the great inversion. And how many of you have heard that term before? The great inversion, the idea is that after what you could view as this sort of strange, anomalous period of 70 or 80 years or 100 years where Americans didn't really think that the centers of city were worth very much, you could say that history is reasserting itself, and we're going back to the normal pattern which exists in most of the world, for most of history, where city centers are valuable. And just look at a couple of these graphs. I think this is an amazing set of graphs from a University of Virginia researcher. And, I had to put on my microphone. There we go. So the lighter line here, this is by the number of miles from the city center. And this here shows the percentage of the population that's college educated in 1990. This is Charlotte. So, this isn't New York, this isn't San Francisco, this isn't Los Angeles, this is just, a nice medium-sized American city. Look at the change from 1990 to 2012 within 5 miles of downtown. So just all of a sudden, college-educated people just want to be in the urban core. Here is per capita income, basically exactly the same thing. Here's Houston, that world-renowned, bastion of urbanity, right? I like Houston actually, but I'm supposed to make fun of it because we're here in Austin. But look at the change here. This is dramatic. And here's per capita income. And this researcher has graphs like this for city after city after city after city in the United States. There are a couple of cities where this isn't happening, but those are the exceptions. The rule is this. And Austin is firmly within this. Okay, but it gets worse, I would say. Some of it's better and some of it's worse. It's better in the sense that urbanity is absolutely returning to the centers of American cities, certainly including Austin. But if you care about housing unaffordability, then the thing that makes it even worse for Austin is that Austin has some particular unusual attributes that I think are going to make these trends even more pronounced here than in other U.S. cities. So one of them is, and I don't know if this is always well appreciated, but we actually have really centralized employment in this city, which is sort of surprising because we're a very car-dependent, spread-out region. Here's a report, one report, that says that we have a bigger share of our jobs within 3 miles of the middle of downtown than any other metropolitan region. More than the ones you would think of. More than Chicago, more than New York, more than kind of the cities that we think of as having giant, spectacular downtowns full of, endless office towers. This is very small, but this is the list of this is just an excerpt of the list, I think, of the 250 largest job centers in the United States. And Austin ranks, I think this is 12th in the country. And, look who's behind us. Dallas has a smaller downtown. Denver does, Miami does, all these places that we think of as bigger. So if you put that together, we have a pretty big downtown for what a relatively small region we are. Packed right next to it, we have the capital of an enormous state, and right next to that, we have this awesome institution that we're sitting in right now. All of that is kind of mashed together in the middle of the city, and so very highly centralized employment. Add that to very underdeveloped public transit, as we all know. And unusually severe freeway congestion for such a small American city, which probably has something to do with the fact that I-35 is an international trucking route, and Austin's the biggest metro area in the U.S. that does not have a second crossing interstate highway. It only has one north-south. So put all that together, lots and lots of growth pressure on the urban core, right? Because if you're affluent and you're in one of those centrally located jobs and you don't want horrendous traffic congestion, you're going to live central. Or even if you work way out in the periphery, if you live in the center, you're going to not be fighting traffic. So central living is even more attractive here than in other places, I would argue. Okay, another kind of unique attribute that we have, very high property taxes. I feel like I'm showing you a lot of boring charts, but hopefully I kept it somewhat in check. But here's Austin. This is a list of the 50 largest cities in the United States, and Austin ranks 9th. And so on a typical $300,000 house in Austin, we're paying half again more than the national average in property taxes. And you'll notice that 5 of the top 10 cities are in Texas, so it has a lot to do with just the structure of our state taxation system. Unlike some other states, above all California, we have very few mechanisms that restrain property taxes from going up over time. In California, if you buy your house, and it goes up in value 10 times, which has happened to some people in California, your property taxes basically just go up with inflation. They don't go up 10 times. Here, that's not the case. And no rent control, obviously. So put all those things together, and in some ways, the low-income households living in our urban core are even more vulnerable to displacement than in San Francisco or Los Angeles or these other places. I think that being severe. Okay. So hard truth number 3, a lot of unpleasantness here, I know. But unfortunately, housing unaffordability is and will continue to fall hardest on families with children. So people with kids, well, what do they want? What do they care about? Or what do they want or need? Well, they need schools, of course, but if you think about it, people with kids are really location sensitive. Often one kid's going to one school, another kid's going to a different school. Maybe one kid needs to go to a special school for kids with autism, or any number of things. People with kids have a lot more locational fussiness than people without kids. People with kids need off-street parking; they just do in almost all cases, even for people who are low income. They want to live in housing units that have their own entrances. People with kids very seldom want to live in apartment buildings with shared hallways. See, I'm getting a few design implications. They really want acoustical privacy. You don't want to worry that your screaming baby is waking up the neighbors. Most people just don't want to think about that. They need nearby childcare, and by and large, they don't want to live high off the ground. They usually want an entrance that's at ground level. They want parks, and they want at least some private outdoor space, I would argue. So, now it's true that in Austin, the twin bugaboos of American urban family life, public schools and violent crime, are actually a whole lot better here than in other large cities. We have pretty good urban public schools compared to other big U.S. cities, and we have a very low violent crime rate for a big U.S. city. But I would argue parents can't find all those amenities that I was listing in the urban core if they're going to move to where they can find them. And increasingly, they're not finding them here in the urban core. At least until the rest of America resembles New York City, right? Where that is a place where lots of middle income people with options choose to live in apartment buildings for their kids. I just don't see that happening in Austin or the vast majority of the rest of the United States. So I really do think that this lifestyle for working and middle class people is on its way out for Central Austin. This is my house, by the way. I can situate myself in this. Well, I'm lucky. I sold a condo in Oakland, California in 2014 that I bought in 2009. So solely because of that, I can live here. That's not a replicable model. Meanwhile, I would argue, people of modest means without kids, yes, housing unaffordability falls on them too, I'm not denying that. But people of modest means without kids, especially who are young, who really want to be in the urban core, they've got some workarounds that they can use, even if they can't, let's say, rent their own apartment. So one thing they can do is they can rent a large house, and 1 or 2 adults live in each bedroom in a large house. And how many of you here are doing something like that? Yeah, I've done that in the past. I did that before I was family. They can live and choose to live in noisy, old, poorly maintained apartment buildings. They can Airbnb out their bedroom or their whole unit and go away for the weekend, bring in extra money. They can crash with friends. There are some co-ops in Austin that cater to childless people in West Campus. A few developers are starting to build micro-unit housing. And I'm probably missing some other workarounds, but the bottom line is that when people with kids compete against people without kids in the housing market, the people without kids are going to win. They're just going to win. This is the pattern everywhere. And a corollary is maintaining, let alone growing the urban core population. I think of it as kind of like running to standstill. So this is some just startling numbers that I saw from this brilliant blogger who's now a brilliant PhD student at MIT. But he analyzed the 100 largest cities in the United States. The blue is what their overall population has done, how it's changed since 1960. So here's Austin. Lots of population increase since 1960. No big surprise there. Now, what's in red is that's the surprising part. This is how much of the population growth happened in the part of the city that was already urbanized or built up in 1960. And you can see that practically every city in the United States, the urban core has essentially gained, either lost population or gained no population at all. And that's Austin. So Austin had as many people in its urbanized core in 1960 as it does now, which I know is surprising to a lot of people. The only cities that gained significant numbers of people in their urban cores: LA, Long Beach, Arlington, Texas, Miami, and San Francisco, and a couple of others, and that's it. Austin's more of the typical pattern. Here's the changes from 2000 to 2010. Most of the census tracts in the core are some shade of yellow or red, meaning they actually lost people from 2000 to 2010. So why? Why is this happening? Fewer people have kids than before, and those that do have fewer of them, and wealthier and educated people have even fewer kids. So, we all know that Austin has just gained enormous numbers of people since 1950, and we all know that Detroit has lost more than half of its population since 1950. But how many of you knew that Paris has fewer people now than it did in 1950? So even, so here's Detroit, kind of our picture of an American city whose economy has collapsed. But then you have Paris, the ultimate example of urban life in the Western world. Even Paris hasn't regained its 1950 population. And so in Austin, we see this kind of trend is manifesting in our school enrollment, right? Austin Independent School District enrollment is now flat, basically, despite the continuing growth of the city. And all this, of course, you might ask, well, is losing kids in the urban core a problem? I mean, does it matter? Should we care about it? And really, that's kind of a value judgment, but in my opinion, absolutely. I think we're going to lose something profound if Central Austin becomes a childless place the way that, for example, San Francisco has largely become. I think that would be a tragedy. And I think it's an avoidable tragedy, so that's what I'm going to get into. But first, I have to get through a couple more hard truths before I can get to the silver lining. How's my fire and brimstone?
We're alone.
Okay, that's what I So my fourth hard truth: there's no reasonable prospect, I would argue, of subsidized housing being scaled up enough to get us out of this fix that we're in. I just don't see it happening. And I say that as someone who spent 6 years of my professional life before I became a pointy-headed academic working in affordable housing development, both for for-profit affordable housing developers, and yes, they do exist, but also for a non-profit subsidized housing development. Have anyone seen the M Station apartments near the MLK Red Line station? I brought my land development class to visit it a couple of times. They're just like the website of Foundation Communities, which is the largest and most sophisticated affordable housing developer in Central Texas. Just like your website says, these are affordable, environmentally friendly apartments. They are family friendly, they're service enriched, they're transit oriented, they're expertly managed. amazing. It's an amazing place. It's everything that people like us say that we should have way more of. You know, this is the answer, right? Alas, I think it's totally unscalable. I just don't see a way that we can build enough of this to make it happen. Here's some numbers. These are my estimates, but my estimate is, I just want you to focus a little bit on this number. I estimate that in Travis County, so not just the city of Austin, but in the whole county, we have about 26,000 housing units that have some kind of housing subsidy. Public housing, low-income housing, tax credit housing, all other forms of HUD housing, and then all the Section 8 vouchers. Add that all up together, and you get about 26,000 housing units, which is a little over 5% of the housing stock in Travis County has some kind of housing subsidy on it, which is pretty close to the nationwide average, actually. Okay, so now this is the City of Austin Strategic Housing Plan, and they say that to sort of stay where we are in terms of housing affordability, over the next 10 years, we're going to need to find a way to build 60,000 housing units that are affordable to people making 80% or less of the median income of the region, which pretty much means subsidized housing. It's pretty tough to build market rate housing that reaches those levels. So just keep those numbers in mind for a second. So 26,000 is all the subsidized housing units that we have in total right now in Travis County. And then 60,000 is the number that we would need to build in 10 years to stay where we are, according to the City of Austin. So what are the chances that we're going to build 2.5 times more subsidized housing in 10 years than we already have right now? Here's another graph from that report, and it's a lot of detail, and I'm not going to kind of really get into it, but the bottom line is if we stay on autopilot, according to the city, we just keep doing what we're doing now, all the current little mechanisms that we have of adding a little affordable housing here, a little bit there, it adds up to 7,300 units in the next 10 years, not 60,000. So are we seriously going to achieve an 8-fold increase in our production rate of affordable housing? I mean, it would be wonderful if we could double it. If we could double it, that would be a magnificent accomplishment. And it would help a lot of people. I am in no way being flippant about this. Affordable housing saves people's lives and helps people's lives. But we're not going to increase it by eight times. I can't see the most far-fetched scenario of that happening. I mean, even this guy, the presidential candidate who was, calling for a workers' revolution, essentially, even this guy wasn't really talking about affordable housing in his campaign platform. So the federal cavalry I don't see them coming to ride to our rescue on this. I just don't. And it's not a pleasant realization, but I think it's an honest one. Hard truth number 5. The other thing it won't say is public transit. At least I don't think it will. Now, first of all, why would public transit help? Well, I think it would help in at least 2 ways. One way is for people who are in the urban core, if people who have, a single person could get by with no cars instead of 1 car, or if a family of 4 could get by with 1 car instead of 2 cars, they could save a bunch of money, and they could use that extra money to buy more housing, right, or rent more housing. And the other way it could help is if we have much better public transit, the cost to your career and job market prospects and education and all the rest of living in Pflugerville or Manor or other further flung communities would be much less because you wouldn't have to battle horrendous traffic congestion every day to access all the economic and cultural and other opportunities in the core. But unfortunately, in my opinion, we blew it, and now we're too far behind for this to really make a difference anytime soon. So Austin's where public transit visions go to die. Probably a lot of you know this history, but in 2000, I think the vote lost by 2,000 or 3,000 votes. But if it had passed, then we would have, by this year, we'd have long since had this light rail line going up Guadalajara, as it's called, linking kind of some of the most important nodes in Austin together. We'd probably be on our second or third light rail line by now. 2014, we voted this line down, decisively in that case. The Lone Star commuter rail vision, which was supposed to link Austin to San Antonio, pretty much collapsed last year. This time, it wasn't the voters' fault, just Union Pacific Railroad just would not cooperate. I don't know. What's the soonest anything could happen? Maybe if we got something to the ballot in 2000 for a single transit line, maybe it could be operating in 2030, realistically. But it's just, this isn't gonna get us out of the fix that we're in, at least not for decades, in my opinion. Here are some of the cities that had no rail transit whatsoever in 1990 that now have multiple light rail lines in 2017. So I don't think you can say, well, we're Austin, we're car dependent, and public transit's just not going to work here. Well, these other cities are the same, but they made different decisions than we did, and we just didn't, for various reasons. Okay, I feel like I've been beating you all down, and I have to, provide a silver lining here. So the first silver lining I'll offer is that our exceptionally low urban core density is, or at least could be, an enormous opportunity. Some more numbers. If you use population-weighted density, I'm going to get just a little nerdy here for a second, but I think population-weighted density is the best way to measure density because it's the density that the average person experiences in the census tract in which he or she lives. So here's Travis County. And even within the context of the big cities in Texas, we're second from the bottom of density. I mean, that's saying something. Being low density in Texas takes, a big, right? Compare that to, our density is less than a third of Los Angeles. But even Denver, which is much more of a pure city, has almost double the density of here at Travis County. So, we have a very low density urban core. And why is that? Well, I would argue that this map holds a lot of the answers. And all this stuff is way too small to read. You don't need to read it. Anyone want to guess what the yellow means?
Single family residential.
Yeah, so the yellow are the parts of the city of Austin that are zoned basically for single family detached in some form and nothing but single family detached. So this point right about here, as the crow flies, that point is less than 3/4 of a mile from City Hall. And yet, this area is just completely, almost all of it is just completely single family zoning. That's a choice that we've decided to make in Austin. In most American cities, if you're within 3/4 of a mile of downtown, you do not have single family only zoning. How many of you have heard the term missing middle housing? It's I think it's a very useful term. It's been kind of brought into our lexicon by Octicos, who are the consultants who have been working on the Code Next rezoning process currently underway in Austin. And the basic idea is it's all the kinds of housing that we built a lot of in American cities 100 years ago, including even a little bit in Austin, although not as much here as in other cities. But we're not, by and large, building it anymore. Instead, mostly we have either single family on the one hand, or we have large apartment buildings on the other hand. And we're not building duplexes, triplexes, townhouses, live works, bungalow courts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Some of these are more traditional forms like bungalow courts, and other ones are more modern like live work. But this is what we're not doing really. Here and there, a little bit of it kind of slips in Austin. So here's an example in the North Loop neighborhood. And by the way, in the Austin context, even small lot detached single-family houses can be thought of as missing middle housing, because our default in Austin is large lot single-family detached housing. Single-family houses that not only are detached, but have to kind of take up a lot of land all by themselves. Here's another missing middle development that sort of slipped through somehow in East Austin. But we're doing very, very little. There's little drips and drabs here and there. So what's so great about missing middle anyways? The standard arguments that I'm hearing a lot are, well, missing middle is good because in an urban design sense, you step down, and it's a good way to kind of form a transition from dense apartment buildings down to single family houses, so it's sort of a nice buffer zone. And then the other argument that I've heard is that it's great for giving people more choices. You know, different kinds of people need different kinds of houses, and so missing middle works for some people. And I totally agree with those arguments, but I actually think the most important argument in favor of missing middle housing is economic, and I'm gonna get to that here. So let us learn from trailer parks. Why is it that trailer parks are so inexpensive? Why do they offer such inexpensive housing for people who live in it? Another way of saying it is, why are mobile homes the most common form of unsubsidized, reasonably affordable housing in the United States? Well, I would argue it's cheap because it's very land efficient. Look how densely packed those mobile homes are compared to the surrounding single family neighborhood. And yet, despite being dense, it's a very cheap form of construction, right? So these are not mid-rise apartment buildings with elevators and lobbies and concrete parking garages and all the things that make buildings expensive. This is a cheap way to build housing. It uses its infrastructure really efficiently. You know, look how narrow those streets are compared to the streets in these single-family neighborhoods. So just less paving, less asphalt, less to maintain, et cetera. You could say trailer parks are really the ultimate example of low-rise, high density, or at least low-rise, medium density. Now, of course, we're not going to build trailer parks in Central Austin. That's just not going to happen. But I would argue, let's learn from them. Let's learn from what makes them successful in an economic sense. So here's a graph that a brilliant former student of mine and Dean, where did he go? Oh, there he is. Kevin Howard, he did a dual CRP and MDS degree a couple years ago, or last year. But he estimated as you go up in density and you go up to these different building types, you know, everyone knows that with denser and denser and denser housing, you're spreading land costs over more and more units, so you're reducing land costs. But what's sometimes not as well appreciated is that the building is becoming more expensive per square foot and per unit. So single-family detached houses are much cheaper to build than multifamily podium apartments. And again, that's because of the hallways, type 3 construction instead of type 5 construction. It's because of fire sprinkling. It's because of the need to have parking in a concrete garage, and all these things that you designers know better than I do, right? But you'll notice that there are these kind of step changes in cost as you kind of ascend through these different unit types. Okay, so just kind of hold that in your mind. By the way, the gray is parking. So look how expensive it is to build the parking in multifamily podium apartments. Okay, so and here's just kind of what these different building types look like at these sort of different density levels. Okay. So when you put those two things together, right, as you're getting denser, you're spreading your land costs around more, and so your land costs per unit are going down, but your construction costs are going up. So depending on what the land costs are, there's a sweet spot. There is an optimal density where your land plus construction costs, which are the overwhelming majority of what you're going to have to pay to build a new housing unit, are at a minimum. And so that sweet spot moves a little bit further to the denser side of the spectrum as land costs go up, not surprisingly, right? And by the way, these land costs, that's like, the periphery of Austin. This is kind of, sort of the middle ring of Austin, and this is more or less the urban core of Austin. Now, those prices may have gone up in the last year or two, but, that's the general pattern. But the thing I'll draw your attention to is, look at this part of the graph. Where are the costs kind of plunging the most rapidly? They're plunging the most rapidly at these lower density levels. So in other words, you gain a whole lot more from going from low density to medium density than you do from going to medium to high density or going from high density to higher density, for the most part. So this suggests that if we would just allow people to build small lot, single family detached houses, rather than just insisting that they can only build large lot, single family detached houses, we could have it would be possible to build housing for far cheaper than it is now. But this is exactly mostly what we said you can't do in Austin. Now, in the places where there are exceptions, this is the former Austin Energy site near the Crestview Red Line station. A very good location, about as transit friendly as anywhere in Austin gets. And these houses are going up right now. I think they're sold out. I think a few of them are still being constructed. I pulled this off the website, a few weeks ago, but these are family-sized houses of 1,700 square feet selling for under $400,000. Now, $400,000 might not sound, exactly affordable or cheap, but that's a few $100,000s cheaper than anything remotely comparable anywhere nearby. So I would argue that this and also the Mueller development show that when we actually allow missing middle housing to be built, it really can be delivered for a whole lot less than other kinds of housing. Okay, but now I have to kind of end our reverie and get back to a hard truth, which is my read is that all indications that we're just not going to do this. We're not going to take advantage of our low density here before. And here's why I think. We passed a comprehensive plan, Imagine Austin, about 5 years ago, and basically its takeaway is that we're going to put 75% of new housing within a half a mile of what are called centers and corridors. So this map shows the various corridors and centers in Austin, and what does that look like? Well, here is the modeling of kind of where the population would grow in Austin if we sort of adhere to that half-mile rule. And you can see that most of the city is just remaining untouched, and we're just trying to put all of our growth into just a very few small areas. And so now it's time for Code Next. That's the rezoning of Austin, and that's happening right now. The city has said what the new zoning categories are going to be, but it hasn't said where they're going to be located. We're all sort of on pins and needles to hear about that. But I think we have a pretty good sense of probably what's going to happen, because our mayor is articulating something that he calls the Austin bargain. Here's what he says. He proposes that we agree not to force density in the middle neighborhoods. In exchange, as part of this bargain, let's also agree that we will adopt a code rewrite that will give us the housing supply we need. At other times, he has said, he's used a figure whereby he said that 97% of existing neighborhoods in Austin will not change. He said that. So this is kind of what he's committing to. In other words, which is pretty much what we've been doing in Austin. So with Code Next, we might get new land use categories and maybe some reductions in parking requirements and a few an easier to interpret code, but the basic spatial pattern is going to be what we're already doing. So we're going to be doing more of this. We're going to be building more giant single-family houses, replacing small single-family houses, right? Because a lot of neighborhoods are just every block has several of these tear-down projects, And then we're gonna be building more places like this, just like we have been. But it's, in my opinion, very unlikely to result in child-friendly moderate income housing. Now, the Austin bargain, it's a totally reasonable and politically viable solution. I can understand why it would be attractive to the mayor, to elected officials, but it's not in any way gonna alter Austin's trajectory towards ever being for the court. And again, I can't prove this yet, but this is my very strong intuition. So we're gonna continue to allow, on the one hand, dense multifamily housing in a very few parts of the city that's too expensive and it's in locations that are totally unsuitable for children, like, very busy arterial corridors like Lamar Airport, South Congress, etc. And then we're gonna also continue to prohibit construction of child-friendly housing that could possibly be reasonably affordable and suitably located. Now, hard truth number 7, which is maybe in some ways a consolation, is that Austin's not alone in this. I mean, many, if not most, other cities have embraced what I think is a really flawed planning ideal. But I think for the reasons I mentioned at the beginning, I think it's especially harmful to Austin. But here's an example. Denver has a similar idea. In their comprehensive plan, the red areas are what they call areas of change, and then the yellow areas are what are called areas of stability. So it's the same kind of thing. If you live in here, don't worry, nothing's gonna change, your neighborhood's just gonna remain predominantly single-family detached housing. So to close, I think we do need to ask some deeper questions about all this. And I'm not pretending that these questions are easy. They involve wrenching trade-offs. There's just no getting around it. But I would put it this way: why is subsidizing the large lot, single family detached house lifestyle our most important local policy objective? And you might say, well, we're not doing that. And I would say, just look at our policies. This is what we're doing. This is what our policy says is the highest priority of land use in the city. And what do I mean by subsidized? Well, here's a project in my neighborhood that's gonna replace water lines along a few streets. And it's each single family detached homeowner is getting $15,000 worth of public expenditures on renewing their water lines, which, no, of course, great, we have to do that. But what are we getting in return for that? In effect, if you do crunch the numbers, the people who are living in apartments are, in effect, subsidizing this cost. Is that a good, is that what our priorities should be? I don't think so, but that is what our priorities are right now. Or another way of putting it is, why is this better than this? And then another kind of deeper question I would ask is, do city dwellers have the right to expect that their streets are in their final physical state? I mean, that's not how American cities grew 100 years ago, before there was zoning. Before there was zoning, people didn't have any expectation that everything would just stay the same. American cities grew by tearing down a small single-family house, replacing it with a duplex or a fourplex, etc. It wasn't always thus. I'm just going to back out of here for a second. Just do a little Google Street View stuff. Nah, never mind. Too hard.
That never works.
Yeah, it never works. Now I have to get back in my PowerPoint presentation. Uh-oh, see my lack of PC usage is getting me in trouble here. Double click on this side, anyways. Oh, yeah, thank you. What I would have shown you was the block that I used to live on in Oakland. And it's a mix. I lived in the fourplex building, and right next door was another fourplex building, and the street, about half of the buildings on the street were detached single-family houses. There were a couple of modest 8 or 10 unit apartment buildings, And American city after American city after American city has building stock like that left over from the pre-zoning era. And we've just said that we're not gonna let that happen. And is that a good choice? I don't think it is. And why does residential character have to equate to large lot, single family detached, right? So often things are posited as though, well, either we're gonna have single family detached or our neighborhoods are gonna be ruined by enormous high-rise buildings. But couldn't we possibly have regulations that say, okay, this area is predominantly residential, the buildings are gonna be lower, and there's gonna be less traffic on these streets, but without insisting that everything has to be one type of residential housing? Single family, large lot detached. And when will we accept that the modestly priced large lot, centrally located, single family detached house is a thing of the past in Austin and get on with it? Okay, my last little remarking to leave us on a happy note. I think it could be possible to form a political coalition to challenge the Austin movement, but it's not gonna be easy, right? I don't know if this is defend deed restrictions, save our lots. I mean, I would argue this is the most important force in American local politics. It is the most powerful organized interest group in city after city, suburb after city, suburb after suburb. Here's something that my council member was quoted saying recently. I'm not wealthy and I'm living in Rosedale. You know, basically is her argument for why nothing should change in the zoning in her area. Well, I mean, she might not think that she's wealthy, but try being 25 years old and trying to buy your first house on a moderate income in Austin. But I think part of what makes this so politically difficult is that the people who would resist this change don't think that they're getting any special benefits, and they also don't think of themselves as especially privileged or wealthy. A couple of other cities have tried variants of what I'm talking about. Seattle, the mayor convened a task force. 65 of the city's top thinkers in real estate development, affordable housing activism, and similar areas, design, lock them in a room together. One of the recommendations they came up with was to eliminate the concept of single-family detached only zoning in Seattle. That was then leaked to a newspaper columnist who wrote about it, and immediately it created a massive political firestorm in Seattle, and the mayor had to just completely backpedal for the retreat from it. So again, I'm not claiming that this is easy. Now, Houston, right? We all think of Houston as the land of shoot 'em up, Wild West, anything goes, urbanism, no zoning. But in fact, Houston does have land use regulation, very much. And in the late 1990s, they actually chose, within their inner loop area, to drop the minimum lot size for houses from 5,000 square feet to 1,500 square feet, just like that. And if you go to Houston, you see some radically different urbanization patterns happening now. Central Houston is full of things like this. And we can debate whether this is good or not, or whether it's a good design, but it is unquestionably resulting in more opportunities for family-friendly, modestly priced housing in the urban core than it does in Austin. Los Angeles has something called the Small Lot Subdivision Ordinance, which on a less dramatic scale allows something similar. And then even Seattle has managed to slip in some missing middle housing in a few places. So, a specific proposal that I'll leave you with is a residential density bonus program, where we already have that in Austin. We say to developers, here's what you can build under the existing zoning. If you want to build more, you're gonna have to give a little bit of it back in the form of affordable housing. Well, what if we did that in a residential area? What if we said, if you want to knock down a single family house, you can build 4 houses, but you've got to give one of them back at cost to a below moderate income household. Just a thought. That would take, at least it would take the affordability argument away from people who, the not in my backyard crowd. So that's probably enough provocation. I'll leave it there.
So do you think this is generational? As in, maybe not like a 20-year problem, but like a 50-year problem, in the sense that 50 years from now, you see a greater, like the shift will be complete, right? The people, all the NIMBYs would have died. I mean, hopefully. Most of them.
Excuse me.
Just gonna throw that out there, but I'm just as it becomes more, as you know, our generation of younger, city core, feel like people would choose that lifestyle, like want to maintain this and knowing these sorts of factors, be in a position to actually do a large scale, create large scale policy change to enforce them.
I do think things could look very different when your generation is running things. I absolutely do.
I was gonna say you get old and have a family too.
What's that?
Like, it doesn't, when you're 25, your thinking is much different from when you're 50. It doesn't matter which generation you're a part of.
Yeah.
It's where you're at in your life.
But, and that's a big debate going on in planning right now. You know, basically, are the supposedly city-loving millennials going to, are they gonna be just like us, boring Gen Xers and baby boomers, when they're getting ready to have kids? My suspicion is that, yes, there will be some of that. I still think that some of the urban values are gonna stick, at least a little bit. I think there is gonna be something of a shift.
I have a two-part question. The first part, let me play devil's advocate a little bit. And so what would you say to someone who brought up the fact that in denser parts of LA, denser parts of Denver, US cities where there is this kind of like missing middle housing, that's still relatively unaffordable, and the trend is not that it's that the price of housing is going down, but it's that we stay constant or going up. That's the first question. The second question is, for one of your earlier graphs that addressed income, how much of the question of creating housing affordability in hot cities is related to increasing supply, and then how much of it is related to addressing the lower part of that graph, constant incomes that are not growing along with the cost of living, basically.
Well, I fervently support efforts to increase incomes and reduce income inequality. But my personal opinion is that it's a cop-out to say, well, it's not a housing problem, it's just an income inequality problem. Because I actually think that there are levers that we could pull that would make things better. That, these bigger structural forces driving wage inequality are national and international forces that we have no control over sitting in Austin. Or we might have a little bit of control, but not much. But I think but there are these other things we could be doing that we're just choosing not to do. And so I think that's on us. And then as to your first point, it's absolutely true. New housing is in an urban core is never gonna reach people at the bottom of the income spectrum. It's impossible, it can't be done. We don't build tenements anymore like we did 150 years ago in the Lower East Side of Manhattan because we have building codes. So that just makes that impossible. But we could certainly, new housing could certainly reach middle income people rather than just very high income people, which is the case now, if we made some different choices. The other thing I would add is when market rate housing becomes cheaper to build, subsidized housing also becomes cheaper to build. Our scarce subsidy dollars would go a lot further if we could build housing for less. Because all the same things making market rate housing more expensive are also making subsidized housing more expensive too.
How do you feel the accessory dwelling unit changes in Austin recently can affect everything you're talking about from affordability and density? Is that a viable?
I think they're great. I love it. I think I applaud Austin for doing that. I think to take it to the next level, our current policy makes it really a lot easier than it used to be to build detached ADUs, but that's the most expensive type of ADU, because you have to basically build a little house in your backyard. I think the next thing they should do is make it possible to subdivide existing large houses into smaller units, because that's a way cheaper way of getting. You might get a new housing unit for $30,000 or $40,000 rather than $200,000 doing that. Okay.
How do you think the shared economy and Airbnb specifically plays into this? I know from experience that when I was attempting to move to Austin, I was about to sign a lease, and the landlord last minute pulled it out from us, saying he had decided to lease it out for a higher return of profit for Airbnb continually instead of using it as a rental property. Is that a detrimental thing to the city as a whole, or is it actually not inconsequential?
I've studied that somewhat along with my colleague Zhenfeng Zhao, and our provisional conclusion is that it's probably not significant on the scale of the entire city. It is probably hitting a very few neighborhoods pretty hard, but at the scale of the whole city, it's in other words, you could remove all Airbnbs tomorrow, and most people in Austin probably wouldn't feel it. That's not to say that what you described is a very real phenomenon, but mostly in a few very popular neighborhoods close to downtown. Tatum?
Jake, this is a little bit pie in the sky, but as you were talking about Austin, I was thinking about a project that is being talked about between TechStart and a city and a company in Dallas at the moment. And they're talking about Elon Musk's Hyperloop, which will pretty much get you from Dallas to Austin like 35 minutes. So if you lived in Waco, you'd be in Austin downtown in 15 minutes. The problem obviously with that is because it's kind of a regional transportation piece of infrastructure, it's not really taking these kind of neighborhoods on the way into account, and that's sort of what they're looking at. How do you think, hypothetically, if something like that actually had to happen, and they're saying that it could be built in 3 years from the time they start to kind of connect to the highways, how would that impact the region, your guess?
Well, I think probably the best place to look to see what that could look like is some places in Europe and Asia that have actually built high-speed rail. And so my understanding, and Juan, you know much better than I would, that some small, formerly declining cities that are now linked, for example, to Madrid with the high-speed rail system have had kind of a revival because all of a sudden they are feasible as commuter suburbs for Madrid. So my sense, just from having followed this very casually in Europe and elsewhere, is that it could have an effect. It's probably not completely transformative because most people probably can't afford to pay the fares to take that kind of a journey every day. But
Cedar Park is growing faster than Austin, and it might be because of the rail.
yeah, although the rail only carries 6,000 people per day, right? So it's
gonna look.
Well, the high speed in Spain is really not for commute. It's really to connect cities. It's part of a big national idea. Spain has, after China, the most miles of high-speed rail in any country in the world, for a country that's pretty small compared with even Germany or France, and it's heavily subsidized by the government, and the returns, I think, are pretty long-term, in the sense that you need to hope that that's one of the things that makes attractive Spain for people to move there. A lot of the Brexit is, they're trying to see how many companies will want to quality of life, be able to connect, but it's really, part of a network. You cannot really think of the high speed as something that you do between two cities. It has to be part of a plan. And from that point of view, I think it's working well because it really is connecting the whole country. But the Basque region is the most prosperous region in Spain. It's not connected to the light rail, to the high speed yet, because of the complications of building it. But they're building it. So they're still, even during the recession, they're still committed to keep building the high speed.
Meanwhile, here in Texas, we have a proposal for a fully privately funded, no public subsidy dollars, high-speed rail plan, and state legislators are still trying to find a way to kill it. So I'm skeptical of anything like that.
So,
Any
Go ahead.
last question?
Sure.
I'll be the adjudicator, alright, go ahead.
This kind of relates to, I think, what everybody's getting at are these trade-offs between transportation costs and housing costs. And you alluded to that somewhat when you talked about, can transit save us, maybe somewhat, if people could have access to a good transit system to reduce the number of cars they had to own, then potentially that money could go toward housing. But I'd like to ask you if whether that assumption is still really valid today. I mean, location efficient mortgages were kind of a popular thing and seemed like a really promising strategy 15, 20 years ago. But given the escalation that we've seen in urban core housing costs, it seems to me, and also the relative consistency we've seen in the costs of automobile ownership and even decline with gas prices recently, that you couldn't possibly anymore make the case that, you know, saving money on an extra car or car ownership is really enough to kind of get you into that location efficient place. I wonder whether or not the real trade-off that people are making or trying to achieve is they're trading time costs for location costs. So because that location efficiency is not graspable, it's not affordable, people have to pay in other means like time and quality of life, and that's where people can sort of make the trade-off.
Yeah, you just Lugerville, and that's
Yeah.
probably what's gonna keep happening, the trajectory.
I'm going to close and invite anyone who wants to continue the conversation just to stick around. Jacob, thanks for a wonderful conversation. Please stick around for more.